Are you seeing double right now? I know I'm not seeing double, but maybe you are seeing double. But today, let's talk about the 10 T206 cards that when you look at them, they look exactly the same, but in reality, they are dramatically different. But first, welcome back to my channel. My name is Chris, otherwise known on X and Instagram as @CRT_Sportscards. And if you are new to T206, you have found the best channel here on YouTube for everything regarding the greatest baseball card set ever produced, that being the T206. So do yourself a favor, hit that subscribe button. But if you're a returning viewer, welcome back. But let's get into these 10 cards right now. First though, why do these exist? Why are there two red Kleinows that look exactly the same, but yet one is Boston and one is New York? That is because it's all about timing. You have to step back in time 115 years. Today, a player changes teams, Topps can have a card out for them within the hour, online and printed within probably 24 hours. This was a very, very different process back then. These cards took months to not only design, but to then produce and then get out to each individual factory to be included with each individual cigarette brand. Now, when you take a look at these 10 cards in the set that are exactly the same, they fall into three different groups. Number one, you have the two error cards. This was basically by mistake. The second group is you have manufactured scarcity, something we in the vintage and the pre-war community just detest about the modern day card collecting game, but it's in this set. And then the remaining six are legit actual transactions of the player. So first, let's talk about the two error cards and the drastic value difference between the error version and then the corrected version. First up here, we have the $1 million card. Joe Doyle, New York National, followed by just Joe Doyle, New York. Now, number one, how did this happen? This is because the designers of the set confused Joe Doyle with Larry Doyle. This was found just a few printings into this Joe Doyle card. And so this card, this error card, was not actually discovered until in the 90s. And when you look at the bottom of the card, it's very, very obvious, and it's surprising for me as a collector. It took nearly 80 years to find a New York National variation because that team name is so off-centered. So then as we look under the hood at some of these population numbers for these cards, looking here at Doyle, number one, from a print group perspective, this is what we consider a rule breaker. It doesn't fall into a 150, 350, 460 group. But that's the only one of this group that falls outside of the normal print group. But you have there, obviously, about 10 known copies, $1 million card. But then on the corrected version, you have 487 PSA graded copies right now. A PSA 1 Piedmont 350, about 120 bucks. And you can see all the various backs that card is available on versus the error one, which is just Piedmont 350. Next up here, we have the second of the error cards, two of the big four, Sherry McGee. Now, this error is way more common than Joe Doyle, but you can see at the very bottom, MAGIE versus MAGEE. You can find a McGee error card. I saw one online yesterday, an A for authentic grade one for $10,000. This is the most achievable of the big four when it comes to Wagner, Doyle, Plank, and McGee. Still, 10 grand for a lot of people is very expensive, but this is simply just a misspelling for McGee. And you'll see right there on the screen why this card only commands around a $10,000 to $12,000 price tag. That is because there are right now, from the PSA perspective, 145 graded copies of the MAGIE error. But then looking at the Piedmont 150 PSA 1, average cost of a corrected version, just $154. But that McGee corrected is in the 150/350 print group with all those backs. Now moving away from the error cards in the set, let's talk about the two cards that are actual manufactured scarcity in the T206. This is two of my favorite cards in the set, and I say that with quotation marks. This is Ray Dimmitt and Bill O'Hara. These cards are only found in Polar Bear. For whatever reason, the manufacturers of this set decided these two players were specific. Both of them played in New York in 1909. Both then came over to St. Louis, different teams, in 1910. So maybe there was some sort of draw as far as, because this is the New York player coming into St. Louis, we'll make these cards separate or different. But these are the only two cards in the entire set that only have this one back, and they're only found in Polar Bear. You can find their New York variations. They're rather inexpensive, but these Polar Bear versions, very expensive. And I can make an argument right now why you should never buy these two cards, and I can also make an argument why you should buy these two cards. When you think about the 520 in the distant future, maybe 520 becomes 518 if these cards reach the McGee level of being over $10,000 for an A grade. Everything lines up with McGee, Dimmitt, and O'Hara having relatively the same print runs, but yet the Dimmitt and O'Hara, even though they're expensive, they have lagged behind because they're not part of the big four. But we could see in the future the big six and the remaining 518 cards. And now here's a look at the cost difference of a PSA 1 Dimmitt right now over $4,000 compared to the New York variation, which is just at about $50. You will also see there the various backs that this card has. And I will tell you, this one is the prettiest one of the two. When you look at O'Hara here, it is very plain. There's no STL on the uniform. But here again, pop count under 200, over $4,000. Yet the New York variation, $50. Now, some of these next 6 cards you have heard me talk about on recent videos. I believe 3 of them I've spoken about in some degree. But it's really, really cool to see them all put together, all 10 cards. And also really, it's a good way to tie in different print runs and when different cards were produced. But first here, we're just going to go in order of their last name. We have George Brown with his Chicago variation, and then we have George Brown with his Washington variation. This happened because of a trade on May 21st, 1909. So what that trade did, though, is stunt the growth of both cards. The Chicago variation is a 150 group printing, but it's missing some key backs. Good example here, there's no EPDG. You see a pop report, 461, right around $90. Looking down at the Washington variation, that is a 350 series back, but here again, missing some key cards. American Beauty 350, Broadleaf 350, Carolina Brights, for example. But the PSA pop report on this one, a little bit lower, 350 plus, average cost right around $105. Next up, we have a card I recently picked up, but the player is, of course, Bad Bill Dolan with his Boston and then Brooklyn variation. As a reminder here, the Brooklyn variation, due to how this transaction happened in late October of 1909. He was released on 10/23 and then picked up by Brooklyn on 10/27. There wasn't enough time to get him a brand new card, so this Brooklyn variation finished up his print run in that Piedmont 350 series. And I mention that because Bill Dolan, Boston, is an Elite 11. So you'll see pricing there at about $330 for a PSA 1, but a PSA 1 Dolan Boston is just about $80 with a pop report just under $500. Moving over to the Brooklyn variation, this is a little bit more expensive, a lower pop count, PSA 1, roughly $200 for a Piedmont 350. And then along the same lines as Dolan, we have the next player we've already spoken about to a degree, Kid Elberfeld with his New York variation and then his very rare, harder to come by Washington variation. This happened due to a transaction in December of 1909 where he was obtained by Washington for just $5,000. And it's funny, Bad Bill Dolan, Tabasco Kid, which is Kid Elberfeld's nickname. Now, here is where you really see a price difference in the two cards, and that's because that Washington variation is one of the hardest to find T206 cards, but a PSA 1 in that New York variation, which is very common, right around 50 bucks. But you look at that recent 1.5 sale of the Washington variation, Piedmont 350, $930. So you could argue here a PSA 1, depending on the quality of the card itself, probably right around $800 to maybe $850. Now, moving on from that Elberfeld Washington portrait, which is one of my top 5 cards of the year that I want to add to my set, let's move down to Red Kleinau with his New York and then Boston variation. This happened because of a transaction on May 26th, 1910. So this card as well helps us with narrowing down when the T206 polar bear cards were produced and then ultimately released. So by May 26th, the designers of the set could not recreate this card, so all they did was scratch out New York and put Boston at the bottom, and yet you've got two very similar cards. But yet when you look at, say, the polar bear variation of both, which are the two cards I showed at the very beginning of the video, you see in the New York variation only 24 graded copies by PSA. Ignore the pricing of these two cards, because then when you look at the Boston variation, that one has a 460 print group. That one right now, from a PSA perspective, has 111 graded. So if you were to pick up one or the other, I'm always buying the New York one if I can find it. And then last but not least, a player that has, for whatever reason, escaped all of my recent content just because he hasn't been connected to anything we've spoken about here recently. But we have Frank Smith with his Chicago and then Chicago and Boston variation. This card exists because on August 11th, 1910, now super late into that 1910 season, he gets traded to Boston. I can only imagine this is DEFCON 1 at the ATC. These cards are probably ready to ship, and yet they have a transaction for Smith. And so the only thing they can do to get this card out is to put Boston at the very bottom. Yet, this is a Chicago uniform. I can only imagine and wonder, do Boston team collectors in T206, do they add this card first, or do they add this card last to their Boston team because of that White Sox uniform on the front of the card? And this Smith variation is very similar to the Red Kleinau. The very first variation is much rarer than the second one. You look there at Polar Bear, there are only 16 known graded examples at PSA. But then when you look at the Chicago and Boston variation for PSA, there are 82 different polar bears. So if I'm picking up only one of these cards, I'm picking up the Chicago variation. So I'm curious, now that you've seen the print run totals, you've seen the backs, you've seen the value difference, what is your takeaway for these 10 different cards? For me, it's very simple. Even though these cards look exactly the same, they couldn't be more different.